I grew up with two fathers, not one. One was my real father, the man who raised me, guided me, and loved me deeply. The other was the father of my best friend. Both men were intelligent. Both were strong personalities. Both wanted the best for me. Yet their ideas about money, work, and life were completely opposite, and those differences shaped everything I later became. One was highly educated but struggled financially most of his life. The other had little formal education but became very wealthy. I call them my poor dad and my rich dad. My poor dad believed strongly in education. He earned multiple degrees, worked hard, and climbed the professional ladder. His advice was clear and familiar. Go to school, get good grades, earn a degree, find a safe job with benefits, and work hard until retirement. He believed job security was the ultimate goal. He believed that if you were smart and honest, money would naturally follow. He often said, "I'm not interested in money, and the love of money is the root of all evil." To him, money was something to be cautious about, not something to pursue. My rich dad thought very differently. He believed schools were designed to create good employees, not financially intelligent people. He believed money was a tool, and if you didn't learn how to use it, it would control your life. He said something that confused me as a child, but later changed my entire worldview. I don't work for money. I make money work for me. While my poor dad warned me about risks, my rich dad encouraged me to learn how to manage risk. While my poor dad said, "Play it safe," my rich dad said, "Learn first, then take action." As a young boy, I was caught between these two ways of thinking. I respected my poor dad deeply, but I was drawn to the calm confidence of my rich dad. My poor dad worked long hours and was always worried about bills, promotions, and job security. My rich dad worked less, thought more, and focused on building systems that generated income whether he was present or not. I didn't understand it at first, but I could feel that one mindset led to freedom and the other to lifelong stress. One of the first lessons Rich Dad taught me was that most people are trapped in what he called the rat race. People work hard, earn money, and as their income increases, their expenses increase even faster. They buy bigger houses, newer cars, and more expensive lifestyles. Their income goes up, but so does their fear of losing it. They become dependent on their paycheck. They think raises will solve their problems, but raises often just create bigger bills. The more they earn, the more they spend, and the harder they must work to maintain that lifestyle. Rich Dad explained that people are controlled by two powerful emotions, fear and desire. Fear of not having money pushes people into jobs they don't love. Desire for a better lifestyle keeps them spending everything they earn. This cycle repeats for decades. People call it life, but Rich Dad called it a trap. He said the key was not to fight these emotions, but to understand them. If you don't control fear and desire, they will control you. Then came the lesson that changed everything: assets and liabilities. Rich Dad explained it in the simplest possible way. An asset puts money into your pocket. A liability takes money out of your pocket. It doesn't matter what people say or how it looks. What matters is cash flow. Most people think their house is an asset, but if it takes money from them every month, it is a liability. Most people buy liabilities and believe they are getting richer, when in reality, they are becoming more financially dependent. The Rich Dad explained, focus on acquiring assets first. Businesses, real estate, investments, intellectual property, things that generate income Once their assets produce enough cash flow, they use that money to buy luxuries. The poor and middle class do the opposite. They buy luxuries first and then struggle to pay for them. This one difference, repeated over many years, creates a massive gap between those who are financially free and those who are not. Another lesson Rich Dad emphasized was financial education. He said schools teach reading, writing, math, and science, but they do not teach money. As a result, most people grow up financially illiterate. They earn money, but don't know how to keep it. They don't understand taxes, investments, or how businesses work. They spend their lives working for money instead of learning how money works. Rich Dad also taught me that mistakes are not something to fear. In school, mistakes are punished. In real life, mistakes are the greatest teachers. The rich are willing to fail, learn, and try again. The poor avoid failure, so they avoid growth. Every time I lost money or made a bad decision, Rich Dad would say, "You didn't lose money, you paid for an education." That mindset changed how I saw failure forever. As I grew older, I began to understand another powerful idea. Income alone does not make you rich. Many people earn high salaries and still struggle financially because their expenses and debts grow alongside their income. True wealth is not measured by how much you earn, but by how long you can survive without working. Financial freedom means your assets generate enough income to cover your living expenses. Rich Dad also taught me to pay myself first. Most people pay everyone else first, the government, the bank, the bills, and then try to save what's left. Usually, nothing is left. The rich reverse this order. They save and invest first, then learn to live on what remains. This creates discipline and forces creative thinking instead of excuses. Over time, I saw the final contrast between my two fathers. My poor dad worked hard his entire life and remained financially stressed, always dependent on a paycheck. My rich dad continued building assets and gaining freedom. Neither man was wrong as a person, but their beliefs led them to very different outcomes. In the end, Rich Dad, Poor Dad is not just a story about money. It is a story about choices, about mindset, about taking responsibility for your financial life. It teaches that the most powerful asset you can build is not money, but financial intelligence. Because once you understand how money works, you are no longer afraid of it. And when fear disappears, freedom begins. As Robert continued spending time with Rich Dad, he began to notice subtle differences in the way the rich viewed the world compared to the poor and middle class. Rich Dad had a way of seeing opportunity where others saw obstacles. While Poor Dad focused on security, rules, and the fear of making mistakes, Rich Dad taught Robert to think creatively, to see potential in every situation. One afternoon, Rich Dad took Robert to visit a small business he owned. It was a modest convenience store, nothing glamorous, but Rich Dad explained the lesson behind it. Most people look at a store like this and see just shelves and products, he said. But I see cash flow, opportunity, and leverage. This store teaches me about customers, about money, about trends. Every business, no matter how small, is a classroom if you know how to read it. Robert watched as Rich Dad counted the cash register, not just for the money it contained, but for the story it told, what products sold, which customers returned, what days were busiest. He began to understand that money was not just currency. It was information. Every dollar had a story, and every investment taught a lesson. A few days later, Rich Dad asked Robert to observe the local neighborhood. "Look at these houses," Rich Dad said. "Do you see the difference between the ones people buy to live in and the ones they buy as investments?" Robert nodded, noticing the well-kept rental properties with multiple units and the single-family homes where people were clearly stretched thin paying mortgages. Rich Dad continued, "A house is not just a home, it can be a liability or an asset. Too many people believe their home is their biggest investment, but a true asset is something that puts money into your pocket, not takes it out." Never confuse lifestyle with wealth. Robert began to see how the rich leveraged assets to create financial freedom, while the poor and middle class often trapped themselves in a cycle of consumption disguised as wealth. The lessons didn't stop there. One day, Rich Dad handed Robert a notebook and asked him to track every single expense for the month. Robert, accustomed to ignoring his small purchases, realized how quickly money disappeared on things that offered no long-term benefit. "Money flows where attention goes," Rich Dad said. "If you pay attention only to bills and obligations, you'll never see opportunity. But if you pay attention to cash flow, to where money moves, you'll start to make it work for you." Robert's eyes opened. He began to understand the concept of financial literacy as more than just numbers. It was a language, a way of interpreting the world that few people were taught. He saw now why schools had never prepared him for real-life money challenges. Poor Dad had taught him arithmetic, grammar, and history, but not how to make money work, how to invest wisely, or how to recognize financial traps. Rich Dad's teachings were filling that gap, slowly but powerfully transforming the way Robert saw life. Soon, Rich Dad introduced Robert to the concept of risk management, another cornerstone of financial intelligence. "Most people are afraid of risk," Rich Dad said. "They save money in the bank hoping it will grow, but inflation and taxes quietly eat it away. The key is not to avoid risk, but to understand it, manage it, and use it to your advantage. A calculated risk, backed by knowledge, is the bridge between mediocrity and wealth." He showed Robert examples from his own life, times when he had invested in small companies, real estate, and even stocks, carefully analyzing the numbers, the people involved, and the market. Some ventures failed, others succeeded beyond expectations, but each provided valuable lessons. Robert realized that failure wasn't something to fear. It was a teacher. And the people who avoided failure at all costs often stayed trapped in mediocrity. As weeks turned into months, Rich Dad emphasized the importance of mindset over money. "Money is a tool, Robert, but your mind is the engine that drives it," he said. "If you are not educated to think like the rich, money will control you. But if you train your mind, you can control money." He taught Robert the importance of asking the right questions. Instead of asking, "How can I buy this?" ask, "How can I afford it?" Instead of saying, "I don't have enough," ask, "How can I make this happen?" Your brain is a problem-solving machine. Feed it questions that force creativity. Robert began to notice how often people limited themselves simply by the questions they asked, and how freeing it felt to shift his mindset to one of possibility, innovation, and ownership. One of Rich Dad's most transformative lessons came in the form of a challenge. He handed Robert a small sum of money and asked him to grow it. "I don't care if it's $10 or $100, he said. "The goal is to think like an investor. Look for opportunities. Don't just spend it. Make it work for you." Robert hesitated, scared of making a mistake, but Rich Dad encouraged him to start small. Over the next few weeks, Robert experimented. He bought small items to resell, explored stock investments, and even considered offering tutoring services to younger students. Some attempts failed, but each failure taught him something new. He began to internalize a critical truth. Success was built not from luck, but from action, experimentation, and learning from mistakes. The journey itself was shaping him, molding his mindset in ways no classroom ever could. Rich Dad also drilled into Robert the importance of education beyond school, emphasizing that formal education alone could never make someone rich. "School teaches you to work for money," he said. "Life teaches you to make money work for you. The rich understand that financial education, how to acquire assets, how to understand cash flow, how to evaluate opportunities, is the real school of life." He encouraged Robert to read, to seek mentors, to study businesses, and to analyze investments. Robert discovered that knowledge, when applied, became power. The more he learned, the less intimidating the world of money became. He was no longer a passive observer. He was becoming an active participant in his financial future. By the end of part 2, Robert's perception of wealth, work, and education had fundamentally shifted. He began to understand that the choices he made today, how he spent money, how he invested time, and how he approached learning, would shape his freedom tomorrow. Rich Dad's lessons were more than just strategies. They were a blueprint for life. Robert realized that the journey to financial freedom wasn't about a single big move, a lottery win, or a sudden inheritance. It was about consistent, disciplined action, smart thinking, and the courage to challenge conventional wisdom. Each day, each decision was a step toward the life he wanted to create, a life where he could make money work for him, escape the rat race, and build true independence. As Robert's understanding deepened, Rich Dad began to teach him one of the most crucial lessons of all, the difference between assets and liabilities. One afternoon, he drew 2 columns in the dirt with a stick. On one side, he wrote assets, and on the other, liabilities. Robert looked at the simple diagram, unsure of how this could change his life. Rich Dad smiled and said, "Robert, most people confuse what they own with what makes them rich. A car, a big house, a fancy watch. They feel wealthy, don't they? But if these things take money out of your pocket, they are not assets. They are liabilities." Robert frowned, thinking of his own family, his parents' mortgage, and the car they had just bought. He realized that despite working hard, they were living paycheck to paycheck because they were spending on liabilities while thinking they were building wealth. Rich Dad continued, "True assets are things that put money in your pocket, even when you are not working. Stocks that pay dividends, rental properties, a business that generates income, these are assets. Your job is a liability if it consumes your time, but doesn't teach you how to make money work for you." Over the next few weeks, Rich Dad took Robert on multiple lessons in the real world. They visited apartment complexes, small businesses, and even warehouses. Robert observed the flow of money, rent payments, product sales, and investments. Each visit was a lesson in understanding cash flow, in seeing how money moved and multiplied. Rich Dad explained, "It's not enough to earn money. You must learn how to make money work for you. That is how the rich create freedom. The poor and middle class work for money. The rich make money work for them." Robert began to see the rat race in vivid detail. He saw how people who earned more were not necessarily wealthier. They spent more, borrowed more, and remained trapped in cycles of debt and bills. He realized that the problem was never income. It was how people thought about money. Then came the lesson on financial education and action. Rich Dad gave Robert a small sum of money and asked him to invest it wisely. Robert hesitated at first, worried about losing it, but Rich Dad encouraged him. "Fear is the enemy of progress. The poor are afraid to invest. The rich see risk as information. Every investment teaches you something. You learn, adapt, and grow." Robert experimented with small investments. Some worked, others failed, but each attempt expanded his understanding. He began to notice patterns in the market, the behaviors of buyers, and the importance of timing. Slowly, he understood that wealth was not about luck or talent. It was about learning, observing, taking calculated risks, and taking action consistently. Rich Dad's next lesson was perhaps the most difficult for Robert to grasp: the power of mindset and emotion in financial success. "Your brain is the most powerful asset you own," Rich Dad said one afternoon. "But if you let fear, doubt, or laziness control it, you will remain poor. Wealth is not just numbers, it's psychology." The rich train their minds to see opportunity, to act when others hesitate, to think creatively about money. He explained that emotions like fear and greed were what kept most people trapped. Fear prevented them from starting, from investing, from stepping outside comfort zones. Greed made them overreach, spend recklessly, or chase short-term gains, without long-term vision. Rich Dad encouraged Robert to observe his own emotions, to separate them from decision-making, and to act with clarity, discipline, and patience. One day, Rich Dad gave Robert a task that would forever change his understanding of wealth. He asked Robert to find an investment opportunity in their neighborhood. Robert was nervous but excited. He walked the streets, analyzed shops, houses, and vacant lots, looking for possibilities. After days of research, he discovered a small property that was undervalued but had potential to rent to local businesses. With guidance from Rich Dad, he approached the owner, negotiated a deal, and invested a small sum. Weeks later, the property generated its first rental income. Robert's eyes widened. He felt the thrill of making money work for him, of creating passive income, of seeing his small investment grow. Rich Dad smiled knowingly. "This is just the beginning, Robert. Wealth is built one step at a time, with patience, knowledge, and action." Over time, Robert also learned about leveraging other people's time and money, a concept that most people never grasp. Rich Dad explained that the rich rarely work alone. They hire, partner, and collaborate to scale their investments. "Your time is limited," Rich Dad said. "If you want to build wealth, you must learn to leverage the time, skills, and resources of others. This multiplies your ability to create income and opens doors that working alone cannot." Robert began to understand that true financial freedom wasn't about working harder. It was about working smarter, using assets, leveraging others, and making informed decisions. By the end of this phase, Robert's thinking had transformed. He no longer saw money as a source of stress or a mysterious power controlled by others. He saw it as a tool for freedom, a way to build a life he controlled, a way to invest in himself and his future. Rich Dad had instilled in him a mindset of opportunity, discipline, and long-term thinking. Robert understood that the journey to wealth was not a sprint. It was a marathon of learning, experimenting, and growing. He realized that financial freedom was less about how much you earn and more about how wisely you manage, invest, and grow what you have. And so, with each lesson, each investment, each small success and failure, Robert stepped closer to the life he dreamed of. A life where he was no longer a passive participant in the world of money, but an active creator, building assets, taking calculated risks, and embracing the mindset of the rich. The lessons of Rich Dad were no longer abstract. They were alive in every decision he made, every opportunity he pursued, and every action he took. As Robert progressed on his journey, Rich Dad began to introduce him to the deeper, often overlooked principles of building wealth. principles that most people never learn in school or from conventional advice. "Robert," he said one morning, "wealth is not just about earning or saving. It's about creating systems that generate money for you continuously. Assets, income streams, investments, knowledge, all of these must work together so your money grows while you sleep." Robert listened intently, realizing that every rich person he had met had systems in place, whether businesses, rental properties, or stock portfolios that worked independently of their daily effort. The concept fascinated him, the idea that money could be an ally, not an enemy, and that freedom came from designing a life where work was optional, not obligatory. Rich Dad emphasized that financial intelligence was the ultimate tool. Most people are not poor because they earn little. They are poor because they do not understand money, he explained. Robert began to see how his poor dad, despite being highly educated and hard-working, remained trapped in financial insecurity. Rich Dad contrasted this with his own life, showing Robert how he made money through investments, real estate, small businesses, and even by understanding the tax code. He explained, the rich use their knowledge to reduce risks, increase rewards, and multiply wealth. Knowledge without action is useless, but action without knowledge is dangerous. Robert realized that many people blindly followed financial advice without truly understanding it, which often led them into debt, bad investments, or wasted opportunities. One of Rich Dad's most impactful lessons was the power of multiple streams of income. Relying on one paycheck, he said, is the fastest route to financial vulnerability. The rich create income from multiple sources: businesses, investments, royalties, rental properties. Each source provides security and growth. Your goal should be to build enough income streams so that you are financially independent, free from fear and worry. Robert began mapping out ideas for his own income streams, exploring real estate, small side businesses, and even intellectual property. He learned that financial freedom was not about working harder, but about diversifying your income and making your money work for you. Rich Dad also taught Robert about the importance of taking calculated risks. Fear is what keeps most people poor, he said, but fear is also a compass. It shows you where opportunity lies. The key is to act intelligently, manage your risk, and learn from failure. Every successful person you admire has failed multiple times before finding their path. Robert reflected on his own small investments. Some had succeeded, some had failed, but each had been a lesson. He realized that embracing failure, analyzing mistakes, and adjusting strategy was a critical part of building wealth. Success, Rich Dad explained, was not a straight path. It was a cycle of learning, experimenting, and persisting. Another lesson that struck Robert deeply was the importance of mindset over money itself. Rich Dad often repeated, "Your thoughts create your financial reality. If you think like an employee, you will live like an employee. If you think like an investor, you will live like the rich." Robert began to notice how many people limited themselves mentally. They accepted low-paying jobs, avoided learning about investing, and feared financial independence. Rich Dad challenged him to think bigger, to dream beyond constraints, and to focus on opportunities rather than obstacles. He reminded Robert that wealth was a combination of knowledge, courage, and disciplined action, and that without the right mindset, even high income could not create freedom. The lessons continued with a focus on teaching and giving back. Rich Dad explained that the wealthiest people are not just rich in money, they are rich in influence and knowledge. When you help others, he said, you create value. Sharing what you know, mentoring, investing in others' success, this multiplies your own wealth in ways you cannot always measure. Robert began to understand that true richness was not just about accumulating assets, but also about impacting lives, creating opportunities, and building networks that strengthened both his wealth and personal growth. He learned that generosity was a tool, not just a virtue, and that contributing to the community amplified success. Over time, Robert applied these lessons diligently. He learned to track his expenses, identify unnecessary spending, and reinvest profits. He built small investments into larger portfolios, diversified his income streams, and continued expanding his financial knowledge. Slowly, the concept of financial freedom became tangible, a state where he could cover expenses with passive income, pursue passions without fear, and make choices based on desire rather than necessity. Rich Dad's teachings were no longer abstract. They were living principles shaping Robert's daily decisions. By the end of this journey, Robert fully grasped the overarching philosophy. Wealth is created through knowledge, action, discipline, and a mindset that sees opportunity where others see obstacles. Rich Dad reminded him, anyone can become wealthy if they commit to learning, take control of their finances, embrace risk intelligently, and act consistently. It's not luck, and it's not inheritance, it's a choice, a mindset, and a plan. Robert realized that financial freedom was not a destination, but a lifestyle, one that could begin with even the smallest steps, grow steadily, and eventually lead to a life of independence, security, and impact. And so, the story of Rich Dad and Poor Dad was no longer just a tale. It had become Robert's blueprint for life, a blueprint for thinking differently about money, embracing challenges, taking calculated risks, and building true freedom through intelligent action. Robert's journey illustrated that wealth is not merely about what you earn, but how you think, act, and grow every single day. He now understood that the greatest asset was not money itself, but the ability to make money work for you. And with this knowledge, his life, and potentially anyone willing to learn, could be forever transformed. As Robert reflected on everything he had learned from Rich Dad, he began to see that financial freedom was far more than just accumulating money. It was a complete transformation of thought, habits, and actions. Rich Dad reminded him, money is a tool, Robert, not a goal. The true goal is freedom. Freedom to live on your terms, to create value, and to make choices without fear. For Robert, this was revolutionary. Until now, he had been trained to see money as a limited resource, something to be earned painstakingly and spent cautiously. Now, he realized that money could grow exponentially when guided by intelligence, discipline, and purpose. The rich, Rich Dad explained, were not born with luck. They cultivated financial literacy, emotional control, and strategic thinking. One of the most profound lessons Robert internalized was the importance of mindset over circumstance. Rich Dad said, the poor and middle class see obstacles. The rich see opportunities. The world is full of problems, and where there is a problem, there is a chance to create wealth. Robert began to understand that every challenge, every limitation, every failure was a chance to learn, adapt, and grow. Fear, he realized, was merely a signal pointing him toward areas where he could develop courage and skill. Greed, if unchecked, could blind people, but disciplined ambition could multiply wealth while creating value for others. Rich Dad also emphasized the power of action and consistency. Knowledge alone was not enough. Robert had to implement, experiment, and persist. Every great investor started somewhere small, Rich Dad explained. They failed, learned, reinvested, and kept moving forward. Time and persistence are your greatest allies. Even the smallest steps taken consistently will compound into extraordinary results. Robert reflected on the small investments he had begun, his first few dollars in stocks, his careful side projects, and how over time, these small actions had begun producing real momentum, teaching him patience, resilience, and strategic thinking. Another key insight was the distinction between assets and liabilities, a concept that Robert now saw everywhere. Rich Dad said, "Assets put money in your pocket. Liabilities take money out." Most people confuse the two and spend their lives accumulating liabilities, thinking it's wealth. Learn to identify assets, invest in them first, and watch your financial foundation grow. Robert remembered the examples Rich Dad gave: buying a car that drains money versus purchasing a small rental property that generates income. This simple concept, repeated over and over, became the framework through which he viewed every financial decision, from his spending habits to investment opportunities. As the lessons deepened, Robert began to embrace the idea of financial education as a lifelong pursuit. Rich Dad explained that wealth is not a destination. It's a journey of continuous learning and adaptation. The world changes, markets evolve, opportunities emerge and vanish. To stay ahead, you must stay educated, stay curious, and stay proactive. Robert realized that every book, every seminar, every conversation with a mentor was fuel for his financial growth. He understood that the rich are not necessarily smarter. They are learners who act consistently on the knowledge they acquire. Perhaps the most profound lesson was the one about giving and impact. Rich Dad reminded Robert that the richest people do not hoard wealth. They share it, teach it, and use it to create opportunities for others. When you help others succeed, you create networks, trust, and influence that money alone cannot buy. Giving back amplifies your own wealth, not just financially, but personally and socially. Robert began to see that true wealth was multidimensional. It included freedom, security, influence, and the ability to make a positive difference in the world. By the end of his lessons, Robert had transformed completely. He no longer feared money. He understood it, controlled it, and used it to build freedom. He no longer followed the conventional path blindly. He created his own. He no longer saw work as a necessity, but as a tool to create value, generate income, and achieve independence. Most importantly, he embraced the mindset of continuous growth, disciplined action, and financial intelligence, knowing that wealth is not a product of luck, but of choice, courage, and commitment. And so, the story of Rich Dad, Poor Dad concludes not with a final number, bank account, or success story, but with a powerful shift in consciousness. The lesson for anyone listening is clear. You can change your financial future by changing your mindset. Embracing education, taking consistent action, managing emotions, investing wisely, and creating systems that work for you. Every decision matters, every habit compounds, and every day is an opportunity to move closer to freedom. The world is full of possibilities, but only those who act decisively, think intelligently, and refuse to remain a prisoner of fear or convention will seize them. Robert's journey illustrates that financial freedom is not about working harder. It's about thinking differently, acting strategically, and growing relentlessly. Rich Dad's teachings, once abstract, are now a living reality in Robert's life. And they can become yours too. Start small, think big, learn continuously, and take action consistently. Build assets, control your emotions, expand your knowledge, and embrace opportunities. Freedom, wealth, and fulfillment are not dreams. They are the natural outcomes of the mindset and habits you cultivate today. Remember, the choice is always yours. You can follow the path of the poor dad, trading time for money and staying trapped in a cycle of fear and scarcity, or you can choose the rich dad path, a life of learning, strategic action, intelligent risk-taking, and financial independence. The seed of wealth begins with mindset, grows with knowledge, and blossoms through consistent action. Your journey to financial freedom begins now, and there is no limit to what you can achieve once you commit, learn, and act. The time is yours. Take it.